I gave money to a homeless man, but it turned out to be my missing father. The wind was howling through the streets of Chicago that evening, a bitter, relentless gale that sliced right through my coat and made my teeth chatter despite the scarf I'd wrapped tight around my neck. It was late February, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones and doesn't let go, and I just clocked out from a grueling 10-hour shift at the warehouse on the west side. My shoulders ached from hauling crates all day, my hands were numb from the drafty loading dock, and all I could think about was getting back to my cramped apartment, kicking off my boots, and drowning the exhaustion in a cold beer. I took my usual shortcut through an alley off Randolph Street, the flickering streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. That's when I saw him. He was an old man, hunched over near a dumpster that reeked of stale garbage, his frail frame trembling beneath a tattered jacket that looked like it had been stitched together from scraps of burlap and despair. His gnarled hands clutched a thin, filthy blanket around his shoulders, and his breath puffed out in shaky clouds, barely visible in the dim glow of a dying bulb overhead. I'd passed dozens of homeless people in this city before, hundreds, maybe shuffling shadows you learn to ignore if you want to keep your sanity. Most nights, I'd just keep my head down, my pace quick, pretending they weren't there. But something about this guy stopped me cold. Maybe it was the way he shivered, his whole body quaking like he was one gust away from breaking apart, or maybe it was the half-eaten turkey sandwich from lunch still sitting in my bag, its weight tugging at some buried shred of guilt. I don't know what it was, but my feet wouldn't move past him. I stood there, hesitating, then finally dug into my pocket. I pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and the sandwich, still wrapped in its greasy paper, and stepped closer. "Here," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, sharpened by the cold and my own unease. "Take this." He lifted his head slowly, like it took every ounce of strength he had left, and his eyes met mine. They weren't just tired or hollow like you'd expect, they were deep, piercing, carrying a weight I couldn't place, like they'd seen too much and remembered it all. "Thanks, kid," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly, scraped raw by years of hardship. I nodded, ready to turn away and shake off the moment, but then I saw it, a jagged scar snaking across his wrist, sharp and crooked, like a lightning bolt carved into his weathered skin. My breath caught in my throat. My dad had a scar just like that. I could still see him in my mind, clear as day, coming home from the construction site when I was 8, his sleeve soaked red, grinning through the pain. "Just a scratch, Toby," he'd said, ruffling my hair with his good hand. That was 20 years ago, before he walked out on me and Mom without a word, leaving us to pick up the pieces. There was no way this could be him, none. My father was long gone, probably living it up somewhere warm, or dead in a ditch for all I knew. I forced a weak smile, muttered something about staying warm, and turned to leave. But as I walked away, that scar stayed with me, burning into my thoughts like a brand. By the time I reached my apartment and fumbled the key into the lock, I couldn't shake it, the scar, the voice, the eyes. They clawed at me, whispering that I just stumbled onto something I wasn't ready to face. I didn't sleep much that night. The image of that old man by the dumpster kept creeping into my head, uninvited, like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I lay there in the dark, my apartment silent except for the faint hum of the radiator and the occasional clatter of a car rattling down the street below. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that scar, jagged, lightning-shaped, stark against his pale, weathered skin. It was too specific, too familiar. My dad's scar had been the same, a permanent mark from that day the saw blade slipped at the construction site. I could still hear his laugh, rough and warm, as he waved off Mom's worry and poured peroxide over the gash. "Takes more than that to stop me, Lisa," he'd said, winking at me across the kitchen table. That was James Collins, my father, before he vanished. Mom always said he ran off with some woman, started over somewhere sunny like Florida or California, leaving us with a stack of bills and a hole where he used to be. I'd spent my teenage years hating him, cursing his name every time Mom worked double shifts at the diner to keep the lights on. By the time I hit my 20s, I convinced myself he was either living it up or 6 feet under, either way, gone for good. But now that scar was shaking everything I thought I knew. I kept telling myself it was nothing, coincidences happen, right? Plenty of old guys have scars. But that voice, that raspy "thanks, kid," echoed in my skull, tugging at memories I'd buried deep. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on my coat, grabbed a granola bar I didn't bother eating, and headed back to that alley. The city was waking up, delivery trucks rumbled past, street vendors shouted over the hiss of steam, and there he was, still camped out on that strip of cardboard by the dumpster. He was picking at the crust of my sandwich, slow and deliberate, like it was the only meal he'd had in days. My stomach twisted, half from nerves, half from something I couldn't name. I shoved my hands in my pockets and walked over, trying to play it cool. "Hey," I said, clearing my throat. "How you holding up out here?" He squinted up at me, his face lined and weary, then shrugged. "Been worse," he muttered, his voice scratching at the edges of my memory again, low, gruff, like Dad's when he'd read me bedtime stories about pirates and buried treasure. I crouched down, pulling a water bottle from my bag and handing it over. "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my tone light, like it didn't matter. He took the water, his fingers trembling slightly, and paused a long, heavy pause that made my pulse kick up. "Jim," he said finally, staring at the bottle like it held some answer he didn't want to face. "Jim. Short for James." My chest tightened. "How long you been out here, Jim?" I pressed, leaning in a little. 20 years, give or take," he replied, his eyes fixed on the ground, like he was ashamed to meet mine. 20 years. The exact amount of time since Dad walked out. My mind raced, connecting dots I wasn't sure I wanted connected. "You ever have a family?" I asked, my voice barely steady. His gaze flickered, just for a split second, then he looked away. "Had one once," he said, so quiet I almost missed it. "Lost M." My heart was hammering now, loud enough I swore he could hear it. I didn't push further, not yet. I left him with the water and a promise to check in again, but as I walked away, I knew I was in too deep to let this drop. That night, I tore through my apartment, digging out an old shoebox stuffed with faded relics from my childhood birthday cards, a chipped toy car, and there it was, a Polaroid of Dad, grinning wide, that damn scar plain as day on his wrist. I sat on the floor, staring at it, the pieces clicking together whether I liked it or not. The next morning hit me like a freight train, tired eyes, racing thoughts, and a gnawing need to know the truth. That Polaroid of Dad sat on my coffee table, staring back at me, daring me to do something about it. Jim, or whoever he was, had gotten under my skin, and I couldn't just wait around hoping he'd still be in that alley. I had to find him again. Problem was, he wasn't there when I went back. The alley was empty, just a crumpled blanket and a few scattered cigarette butts where he'd been sitting. My stomach sank. What if he'd moved on? What if I'd missed my shot? I couldn't let that happen, not after 20 years of wondering. I started searching, desperation creeping in with every step. I walked the streets for hours, checking every corner near Randolph, under bridges, behind storefronts, anywhere a guy like him might crash. The wind bit at my face, but I barely felt it, too focused on scanning every shadow. I asked around, voice tight with urgency. "You seen an old guy, gray hair, scar on his wrist?" I'd say to bus drivers, shopkeepers, even a couple of rough-looking dudes huddled over a fire in a barrel. Most just shrugged or shook their heads, but one lady at a bodega frowned and said, "Maybe by the park, he hangs out there sometimes." It was a lead, thin as it was, and I clung to it. By late afternoon, my legs ached and my throat was raw from the cold, but I kept going, combing through Washington Park until dusk settled over the city like a heavy curtain. Then I saw him. Shuffling toward a bench near the fountain, head bowed, that same tattered jacket hanging off his frame. Relief crashed over me, mixed with something darker, heavier. I wasn't losing him again. I approached slow, my boots crunching on the gravel path, and sat down beside him. "Hey, Jim," I said, pulling a coffee from my bag, still hot from the gas station. "Thought you might need this." He took it with a grunt, wrapping his hands around the styrofoam cup like it was a lifeline. I studied him, the lines etched deep into his face, the way his shoulders slumped like he carried the world. "You from around here originally?" I asked, easing into it. He sipped the coffee, staring at the steam curling up into the gray sky. "Used to be," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Long time ago." I nodded, then took a chance. "That bracelet," I said, nodding at the worn leather strap peeking out from his sleeve. "Where'd you get it?" His hand froze mid-sip, and for a moment, I thought he'd bolt. Gift, he muttered, his tone sharp, like I'd stepped on something fragile. From someone I let down. My mom had given Dad a leather bracelet just like that, handmade, simple, a 5th anniversary present he'd worn every day until he left. I'd seen it in photos, seen him twisted around his wrist when he was nervous. My pulse quickened. I didn't push him then, just thanked him for the chat and headed home, but the pieces were falling into place. That night, I dug deeper. I found an old letter Dad wrote Mom, tucked in a drawer with some junk mail, a scrawled apology for working late, signed with his sloppy J. I compared it to a note Jim had scratched on a napkin when I'd given him a pen to doodle with, same crooked lines, same shaky loops. It wasn't just the bracelet or the scar anymore. The handwriting matched. This wasn't some random guy. This was James Collins, my father, sitting on a park bench, alive and broken, after 2 decades of silence. I sat there, the letter trembling in my hands, knowing I couldn't avoid what came next. Tomorrow, I'd confront him. No more guessing, no more running. I needed answers, and he was going to give them to me, whether he wanted to or not. The next day broke gray and heavy, the sky over Chicago thick with clouds that promised snow but hadn't delivered yet. I barely slept, my mind a tangle of anger, hope, and dread. That Polaroid of Dad, grinning, scar glaring, leather bracelet snug on his wrist, burned a hole in my pocket as I shoved it there and headed out. I wasn't waiting anymore. I'd spent 20 years wondering why he left, building him up as a villain or a ghost, and now he was real, flesh and blood, sitting on a park bench like some stranger I'd stumbled across. I couldn't let it slide, not after finding him, not after chasing him down. My boots hit the pavement hard as I marched back to Washington Park, the coffee I'd grabbed for him sloshing in its cup, more an excuse than a peace offering. He was there, same spot, hunched over on that weathered bench, staring at nothing like the world had forgotten him. Maybe it had. I didn't sit this time, I stood over him, my shadow falling across his lap, and pulled the photo out. "This you?" I said, my voice louder than I meant, sharp with years of pent-up hurt. He flinched, his head jerking up, and when I shoved the Polaroid into his hands, he froze. His fingers trembled as he stared at it, himself, younger, happier, a lifetime ago. "Where'd you get this?" he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. I leaned in, close enough to see the tears welling in his eyes. "It's my dad," I said, each word a punch. "James Collins. Left me and my mom 20 years ago. That's you, isn't it? Don't lie to me." He tried to stand, his legs wobbling like a newborn foal, but they gave out, and he sank back onto the bench with a ragged breath. His hands clutched the photo, crumpling the edges, and then he said it, quiet, broken, "I'm sorry, Toby." My name. He knew my name. Something snapped inside me, and I lost it. "Sorry?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the empty park. "You disappeared. You left us with nothing." Mom worked herself sick, cried herself to sleep, and I thought you were dead or off screwing around somewhere. "I was 8, you bastard. Why didn't you come back?" My fists clenched, my chest heaving, and he just sat there, tears streaking down his weathered face. He wiped them away with a shaky hand and looked up at me, eyes raw with guilt. "I couldn't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up bad, Toby. Real bad. I wanted to hit him, to walk away and leave him there to rot, but my feet wouldn't move." "Tell me," I growled, my throat tight. "Tell me why." He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the story spilled out, slow at first, then like a dam breaking. No other woman, no sunny escape. He'd gotten in deep with loan sharks, borrowed money he couldn't repay to keep the house after a layoff. They came for him, knives, threats, promises to hurt us if he didn't settle the debt. "They said they'd come for you and your mom," he said, his voice breaking again. "I couldn't let that happen. So I ran. Thought if I disappeared, they'd leave you alone." I stared at him, the anger boiling over into something else, confusion, pain, a twisted kind of pity. "You let us think you abandoned us," I said, quieter now. "You let me hate you." He nodded, his head dropping. "I watched you sometimes," he admitted, barely audible. "From a distance, your baseball games, your graduation. Couldn't get close. Didn't deserve to. My knees felt weak, and I sank onto the bench beside him, the fight draining out of me. 20 years of lies and half-truths, and here he was, my father, not a traitor, but a man who'd broken himself to save us. I didn't know what to feel, but I knew one thing: this wasn't over. The park was silent after his confession, save for the faint rustle of bare branches in the wind and the distant hum of traffic beyond the trees. I sat there next to him, James, my father, my head spinning, my heart a mess of knots I couldn't untie. The anger I'd carried for 20 years was still there, smoldering, but it was tangled up with something new, a raw, aching understanding I hadn't expected. He hadn't run off with some woman or ditched us for a better life. He'd run to protect us, to keep those thugs away from me and Mom. All this time, I'd painted him as a coward, a deadbeat, when really he'd been out here, breaking himself so we could keep going. Why didn't you tell us? I asked, my voice hoarse, barely holding together. Even after it was over, why not come back? He rubbed a hand over his face, smearing the tears into the dirt on his cheeks. By the time I paid him off, years had passed, he said, his words heavy with regret. I'd lost the house, the job, everything. I was a wreck, Toby. Couldn't face you like that. And your mom, she deserved better than a failure showing up on her doorstep. I shook my head, staring at the cracked pavement beneath my boots. She died thinking you didn't care, I said, the words cutting deeper than I meant them to. He flinched, like I'd slapped him, and let out a choked sob. I cared, he whispered. More than you'll ever know. That's when he dropped the twist that hit me hardest. I stayed close, he said, his voice trembling. Watched you grow up from a distance. Your little league games, I'd stand behind the fence. Your high school graduation, I was there, back row, in a borrowed coat. Even got a job sweeping floors near your warehouse once, just to see you walk by. My breath caught. All those years I'd felt alone, he'd been there, a shadow I never noticed. The truth sank in slow, he hadn't abandoned me, not really. He'd been searching for me, waiting, too scared to bridge the gap. I looked at him, then really looked. The man I'd hated was a shell, hollowed out by guilt and time, but he was still my dad. Something shifted inside me, and I made a choice. Come on, I said, standing up and holding out my hand. You're coming with me. He blinked, confused, his eyes searching mine. What? Home, I said, firm. You're not staying out here. He hesitated, then took my hand, his grip weak but real. I helped him up, and we walked, slow, unsteady, back to my apartment. Over the next few days, I got him cleaned up. A hot shower, a shave, some old clothes that almost fit. I cooked him a real meal, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, and watched him eat like he hadn't tasted home in decades. We talked, halting at first, then easier. He told me stories, some I remembered, some new, about the good days before it all went wrong. I told him about Mom's last years, about my life, the warehouse job, the quiet nights. We cried some, laughed a little, and started picking up the pieces. I found him a doctor, got him on meds for the cough he'd been hiding, even called in favors to line up a part-time gig at a friend's garage. He's staying with me now, sleeping on my lumpy couch until we figure out something better. It's not perfect, there's still pain, still scars, the kind you can't see, but we're healing. I forgave him, not all at once, but bit by bit, and he's forgiven himself, or at least he's trying. We've got time now, time to rebuild, to be father and son again. Last night, he looked at me over a cup of coffee and said, I never thought I'd get this back. I smiled and said, me neither, Dad. But here we are. And ahead of us? A future, messy, uncertain, but ours.